Why the West sees its own shadow in Israel. She was sitting in the pristine conference hall of London's Royal Institute of International Affairs when it happened. The moment that would fundamentally shift how she understood the psychology of international criticism. A British member of Parliament was delivering an impassioned speech about Israel's disproportionate use of force in Gaza, his voice rising with moral indignation as he spoke about civilian casualties and violated international law. The audience nodded approvingly at his righteous condemnation, but she noticed something else: an Iraqi refugee sitting 3 rows ahead, slowly shaking his head. After the session ended, the Iraqi man approached her in the corridor. His voice was quiet, but his words cut through the diplomatic politeness like a blade. The country responsible for the deaths of at least 500,000 Iraqis is lecturing Israel about 100 Palestinian deaths. What kind of morality is this? That question haunted her for months. Not because she disagreed with criticizing civilian casualties. Any civilian death is a tragedy. But because she began to see a pattern that was far more disturbing than the conflicts themselves. The West wasn't just criticizing Israel. It was projecting its own shadow onto Israel to avoid confronting the ghosts of its own making. To understand this psychological mechanism, we must first acknowledge an uncomfortable truth about Western foreign policy over the past 2 decades. Since 2001, Western nations have launched military interventions that have reshaped entire regions, displaced millions, and caused civilian casualties on a scale that dwarfs any Middle Eastern conflict. The Iraq War alone, based on weapons of mass destruction that never existed, resulted in death tolls that range from conservative estimates of 100,000 to more comprehensive studies suggesting over 100,000 deaths. Libya, once Africa's wealthiest nation, was reduced to a failed state where slave markets now operate openly after NATO's humanitarian intervention. Afghanistan endured a 20-year occupation that ended with the chaotic withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power. These are not distant historical events. They are the defining foreign policy actions of the current generation of Western leaders. The same politicians, military officials, and foreign policy establishment that orchestrated these interventions are the ones who today position themselves as moral arbiters of international law when discussing Israel and Palestine. Yet somehow, in the Western discourse, Israel has become the singular symbol of international law violation, the primary example of disproportionate force, the go-to case study for civilian casualties in warfare. This is not an accident. It is a carefully constructed psychological defense mechanism. Consider the moral mathematics at play here. When British officials condemn Israel's military actions in Gaza, they do so from a country that participated in a war based on fabricated intelligence that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. When French politicians lecture about proportionality, they speak from a nation that has conducted military interventions across Africa for decades, including in Libya, where French warplanes targeted civilian infrastructure. When American lawmakers invoke international law in condemning Israel, they represent a country that has dropped more bombs in the past 20 years than any nation in history, often with civilian casualties that far exceed those in any Israeli operation. The psychological function of this displacement becomes clear when we examine what happens when these same Western nations are confronted with their own actions. There are no annual UN resolutions condemning the Iraq War. There are no international solidarity movements for Libyan civilians. There are no campus protests demanding divestment from countries that participated in the Afghanistan occupation. The moral outrage that burns so intensely for Palestinian suffering somehow dims to a flicker when applied to the victims of Western military interventions. This is the essence of psychological projection, the unconscious transfer of one's own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or behaviors onto another person or group. In international relations, it manifests as the displacement of moral anxiety about one's own actions onto a more manageable target. Israel, as a Western-allied democracy engaged in a highly visible conflict, becomes the perfect vessel for this displaced guilt. The projection serves multiple psychological functions for Western societies. First, it provides moral absolution. By focusing intense criticism on Israel's actions while remaining silent about their own government's far more destructive interventions, Western publics can maintain their sense of moral superiority without confronting uncomfortable truths about their own complicity. Second, it offers emotional catharsis. The genuine horror at civilian casualties, which should be felt about all conflicts, gets channeled entirely toward one conflict, providing psychological relief while avoiding the more painful process of examining larger patterns of violence. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it reinforces Western identity as the moral center of the international system. By positioning themselves as the critics of Israeli actions, Western nations maintain their role as the arbiters of right and wrong, even while their own actions suggest a far more complex moral reality. The most revealing aspect of this projection is how it manifests differently across the global community. When she traveled to the global south, to conferences in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, she encountered a fundamentally different perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict. It wasn't that people in these regions were indifferent to Palestinian suffering. Rather, they saw it as one tragedy among many, and they were acutely aware of the broader patterns of Western military intervention. A Nigerian diplomat once told her, "We sympathize with both Israelis and Palestinians because we understand what it means to live with the consequences of colonial boundaries and external interference. But we also remember who carved up our continent, who extracted our resources, and who continues to intervene in our politics. The same countries that lecture Israel are the ones that have never stopped intervening in our affairs." This perspective, shared across much of the global South, reveals the projection for what it is. The 88% of the world's population who live outside the Western sphere can see clearly that the rules-based international order is often simply a cover for Western power projection. They remember who colonized them. They know who continues to intervene in their political systems through economic pressure, military bases, and covert operations. When these same powers suddenly discover international law in the context of Israel-Palestine, the selectivity is not lost on them. The projection becomes even more apparent when we examine the language used to describe different conflicts. Israeli military operations are characterized as disproportionate and violations of international law, while Western interventions are described as humanitarian interventions or responses to threats to national security. Israeli settlements are illegal under international law, while Western military bases in dozens of countries are partnerships and security cooperation. Palestinian civilians are innocent victims, while Iraqi or Afghan civilians become collateral damage or unintended consequences. This linguistic manipulation serves to obscure the fundamental similarity between the actions being condemned and the actions being excused. It allows Western societies to maintain psychological comfort while engaging in selective moral outrage. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this projection is how it actually harms the very cause it claims to champion. By making Israel the singular focus of international law criticism, Western societies avoid the deeper conversation about the structural problems with how powerful nations behave internationally. They avoid confronting the reality that their own governments routinely violate the principles they claim to uphold when it comes to other nations. This selective focus also provides Israel with a ready-made defense, the claim of double standards. And they're not wrong. When Israeli officials point out that their critics have caused far more civilian casualties in their own military operations, they're making a factually accurate observation. When they note that other Middle Eastern conflicts with far higher death tolls receive far less international attention, they're describing a measurable reality. The projection doesn't just provide psychological comfort to Western societies, it also provides political cover to the very government it claims to be pressuring. The path forward requires acknowledging this projection and moving beyond it. This doesn't mean stopping criticism of Israeli actions when they violate international law or cause unnecessary civilian suffering. It means applying consistent standards. It means Western societies confronting their own government's violations of international law with the same moral intensity they apply to Israel. It means recognizing that selective moral outrage is not moral clarity, it's moral cowardice. The Iraqi refugees question in that London corridor wasn't just about numbers or body counts. It was about integrity. It was about whether Western societies can develop the moral maturity to look in the mirror before pointing fingers. Until that happens, the projection will continue. Palestinian suffering will persist. Israeli intransigence will be reinforced, and the broader patterns of international violence will remain unchallenged. The most powerful empires in history have always found ways to avoid confronting their own moral contradictions. The unique tragedy of our time is that this avoidance, disguised as moral concern for Palestinian rights, actually perpetuates the very injustices it claims to oppose.